Today I want to talk about learned helplessness. I'll see you inside. So I really want to just jump right into this one. Learned helplessness is actually a psychological phenomenon that arises from being repeatedly exposed to a negative experience, which can lead to the belief that your actions have absolutely no impact on the outcome. This perception of powerlessness can have some serious consequences on your mental health, and it can even contribute to things like anxiety, especially depression, and even other psychological disorders. And now it appears that this idea was first introduced by a man named Martin Seligman. And this was in the 1960s, where he actually conducted an experiment on dogs to study the effects of uncontrollable stress on their behavior. Uncontrollable stress is simply something from the outside world that we perceive that we cannot stop. And in his study, dogs who were exposed to electric shocks they couldn't control eventually stopped even trying to avoid the shocks altogether. Interestingly, they even did this when they had the opportunity to actually avoid the shocks. Simply put, these dogs were put into a box with two different sides. One side would give them a shock, and the other would not give them a shock. And now initially they are put in the side of the electric shock, but were able to escape by jumping over a small barrier to the other side where there would not be a shock. And this was the first experiment, and the dogs simply learned that they could just jump over this small barrier and stop the external stress. However, in a different experiment, they actually raised the level of the barrier so that the dogs were unable to actually jump over the barrier and escape the shock. Eventually, these dogs simply just laid down and accepted the shock. Now, the experimenters took these same dogs and lowered the barrier to what the other dogs were able to jump over. However, after these dogs had learned that there was no hope, they didn't even try to jump over the barrier. So these dogs remained laying down receiving the shock despite actually being able to escape it just by jumping over the barrier. Simply, it's an act of learned helplessness, as they were unable to escape the shock before, so they learned that there was no use in even putting in effort to stop it. Now, since then, there's been a lot of studies conducted to actually learn about learned helplessness in humans, and it's been linked to a lot of mental health disorders. Simply, the people that demonstrate the highest level of learned helplessness typically are the ones that go on to develop mental health disorders. And oftentimes the trigger for this is simply just chronic stress or chronic trauma. And now it seems that the key factors contributing to learned helplessness is simply just the belief that a situation is permanent and unchangeable. And this is oftentimes caused by an all or nothing type thinking or just overgeneralization, which leads people to view negative events as much larger and much more unmanageable than they actually are. And I think a predominant example is actually sticking to a diet. While I'm not yet sure how I feel about the word diet, for the sake of this discussion, it's pretty useful. And we can actually see how this all or nothing mentality plays out in the real world. So the reason most people need to go on a diet is because their dietary habits prior were not very good. So they then change them to much healthier habits, which is usually a great idea. However, if they slip up and make a mistake one time, oftentimes this all or nothing mentality makes them think of just giving up altogether. And the excuse for giving up is simply that they have no control over their cravings. So it's no use trying to fight them. But unfortunately, typically when someone gives up, they don't keep any of the healthy habits that they have developed, and they simply forget all of them. So they turn from eating 3 healthy meals a day to never eating any healthy food at all. And the excuse for this behavior is that they will eventually fall off, and because of this all or nothing mentality, there's no use in trying anyway. And now I just kind of want you to think about this for a moment. When was the last time someone had a difficulty with their diet, and instead of stopping it altogether, they decided to keep most of their habits and just give themselves a little bit of freedom every once in a while? And I know you may come up with a random example, but this typically isn't how people behave. But I think understanding this actually gives us a way that we can potentially be a little bit looser on our diet without absolutely going off the rails. Simply just trying to be as mindful as possible about the majority of our choices. And if we happen to slip up every once in a while, it's not the end of the world. The only thing we need to do is just get back on track in the next meal or the next day. And I even hesitate to say the next day because people can mess up in the morning and decide, okay, for the rest of the day, I'm going to purposefully go off track. And this is where I sometimes have a little bit of trouble with the word diet. And I'm sure you've heard it before, but I think it's much less important to think about being on a diet and just think about living a healthier lifestyle. Because unfortunately, due to this common occurrence of an all or nothing mentality, you're either strictly adhering to a diet or not adhering to it at all. But instead, it's probably much smarter to just try and make the healthiest lifestyle choices whenever it is possible. For example, when you go out to eat, instead of saying, well, since I'm out to eat, I'll get the cheeseburger, some cheesecake, and a side of cheese fries, because for some reason we just really like cheese. Maybe instead you just choose the steak with double veggies and as much fruit as they have, and maybe you treat yourself with a dessert thereafter. You enjoy yourself in the moment, and then the next time that you have a meal that you can prep yourself, you go back to exactly the healthy lifestyle choices that you put in place. Another example would be missing a workout. You can miss one workout and go to the next one, but oftentimes people miss one and they think it's no use to try and exercise at all because they inevitably fail. And now, I like the concept of learned helplessness, but I think oftentimes it's actually just an excuse not to put effort in. Anytime something is hard, obviously the brain is going to try and find any reason why we shouldn't be doing it, and we should be doing something more comfortable. And I think the reason that this all or nothing mentality actually develops is because we're trying to almost give ourselves an excuse that if we can't stick to it 100%, we shouldn't stick to it at all. Interestingly, a lot of these studies actually find that if we contribute our inability to do something to internal factors, we are more likely to exhibit learned helplessness than if we attribute them to external factors. For example, if we are taking a test that is very difficult and we say, I'm not good at this or I'm not able to do this, then we are more likely to feel and exhibit this learned helplessness. However, if we look at it and say, oh, the test is too hard or there were distractions in my environment, then we are less likely to exhibit learned helplessness. And now, why is this important? Because the first individual who said that they were not good enough won't even try hard on the next time that they have to take a test because they think it's something that they cannot change inside of themselves. Conversely, the individual who said, oh, this test was too hard, will still give effort on the next test just in case it's less difficult. I just want you to think about times in your life where you haven't even tried to do something because you perceived it as being too hard or too difficult. And I think one of the most popular and most understood example would be the 4-minute mile. People had tried to run a mile in under 4 minutes before, but people began thinking that it was absolutely impossible for humans to actually run a mile in less than 4 minutes. Simply, it would be too taxing on the cardiovascular system. However, the moment after the first person ran a mile under 4 minutes, many other people began doing the exact same thing. And I don't think it was because people weren't able to run the 4-minute mile before Roger Bannister, the first man who did it. Rather, they weren't even trying because they perceived it as impossible. But once people started to believe that it was actually possible, so many more people attempted it and were able to accomplish it. People simply had the confidence to push the pace a little bit in the first few hundred meters, and they had the confidence that they could maintain it the rest of the mile and achieve the sub 4-minute mile. But before it happened, people would maintain a pace that was over 4 minutes because they were scared that they wouldn't be able to maintain a 4-minute pace, so there was no reason to try at all. Simply they had learned that it wasn't possible, so there's no reason in trying, and staying in this comfortable place is the best bet. And this honestly just makes me wonder how many things are actually possible that we think are impossible, so no one actually tries. And the way that this could bleed into your life is maybe there are things that you think, oh, they're able to do that, but I am not. I am not able to eat healthy because I lack the willpower. I am not able to run 1 mile because I lack the fitness. I am not able to get a college degree because mentally I am not strong enough. Oftentimes, these are just barriers we put on ourselves and no one else has actually put on us. And I'm not sure what all this information is actually going to mean for your life because it can be applied in so many different ways. However, I think just hearing someone talk about it brings it into your conscious awareness and maybe you'll look out for it in the future. Simply just look out for all the times that you're holding yourself back, not because you can't do something, but because you believe you can't do something. And I didn't mean for this to turn into a motivational podcast or anything like that. I think it's just important to understand that there is a psychological phenomenon that actually restrains us from trying new things that we could potentially be really good at. And it's almost a comforting place for humans, which means most humans actually will do this. Therefore, if you do it, it's not bad or wrong, it's actually common. Which simply means that even if you don't think that this is something you do, there are probably areas of your life that you will do it. And it doesn't have to be in health, it could be in work or in love, in finances, anything like that. You may think you are unable to save money because you always want to buy new things. Like I said, there are just so many examples of this learned helplessness that are demonstrated throughout our daily lives. And I just hope listening to this podcast, you can take a step back and try and find them. I think you could make this into a game of actually trying to pinpoint as many of these as possible so then you have the ability to change it in the future. And now I'm recording this one in the middle of high school and it is time to go to my next class. So I hope you enjoyed this and I hope you come back next time. You can find all of my social media and any of my writing and YouTube, anything in the description of this podcast. You can follow me on Instagram at Calvin_Scheller. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope to see you next episode.